Combat medics only know how to bandage. They can't carry anything real. The mocking words rang out as Emily Carter, 27, clutched a Marine bleeding from A. Chest wound, preparing to climb 200 stone steps. To her comrades, she was just a small nurse who wouldn't survive. Halfway, but Emily gritted her teeth, hauling the soldier toward the bunker, only to collapse in exhaustion. And the next morning when she awoke, the door opened to 500 Marines saluting her, turning yesterday's insults into legend. Emily stood there in the dusty heat of the base, her boots scuffed in her, uniform plain no insignia, shouting her rank. She was small, barely 5 feet 2 inches, with a face that looked too young for the war. Zone around her. Her hair was pulled back tight, no makeup, no polish, just a quiet kind of beauty that didn't demand attention. The other soldiers barely noticed her most days unless it was to toss a jab about her size or her job. To them, she was just a medic, the one who patched up cuts and handed out pills. Not a warrior, not someone who belonged in the thick of it. They'd see her walking across the base, her med bag slung over her shoulder, and they'd smirk. Nurse, they'd mutter like it was an insult. She never corrected them, never raised her voice, but her eyes, sharp, steady, caught every word. Before everything went to hell that day, Emily was checking supplies in the aid station. The air was heavy, the kind of dry heat that made your throat itch. She was counting bandages, her hands moving, quick but careful when a group of Marines walked by, big guys all muscle, and swagger, their rifles slung loose, like they owned the place. One of them, a guy named Kessler, with a jaw like a brick and a grin that cut, stopped and leaned against the door frame. "Hey, Carter," he called loud enough for the others to hear. "You ever lift anything heavier than a Band-Aid?" The others laughed, a sharp barking sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Emily didn't look up. She kept counting. Kessler pushed harder. "Bet if we toss you a real load, you crumple." Another guy, Jenkins, chimed in, his voice dripping with fake pity. "She's too delicate for that, man. Stick to your little nurse kit." Emily's fingers paused on a roll of gauze just for a second. Then she kept going. A few hours earlier, Emily had been in the mess hall, grabbing a quick coffee before her shift. The room was loud, filled with clattering trays and soldiers talking over each other. She stood off to the side, stirring her coffee with a plastic spoon, when a corporal named Larson, a guy with slick back hair and a habit of name-dropping his connections, spotted her. He nudged the guy next to him, a private with a loud laugh named Gibbs. "Look at Carter," Larson said, his voice carrying, standing there like she's waiting for a bus, not a war. Gibbs snorted, spilling his drink. "What you gonna do when the real stuff hits? Hand out aspirin?" The table erupted, heads turned to stare at Emily. She stirred her coffee once more, the spoon scraping the bottom of the cup, then set it down and walked out, her boots quiet on the tile. Larson called after her, "Don't trip on your stethoscope, nurse." The laughter followed her out the door. "If you're feeling this, if you've ever been looked down on for no good reason, just take a second, grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep telling stories like this. Stories that hit deep and show what people are really made of. Let's keep this going together." The jeers didn't stop there. Later that morning, Emily was crossing the yard heading to check on a soldier with a sprained ankle. A group was lounging near the mess hall, passing around a water bottle and talking loud. One of them, a lanky guy, named Torres with a chipped front tooth and a habit of talking over everyone. Spotted her. "Yo, Carter," he shouted. "You ever think about getting a real job? Out here. Combat medic's just a fancy way of saying you're scared of the front line." The others snickered, one of them, spitting into the dirt. A big ma, Ryan. Sullivan built like a tank and always, itching to prove it, added his own jab. "If you can haul anyone up those 200 stairs to the bunker, I'll kneel right here and call you boss." The group roared, slapping each other's backs. Emily stopped walking. She turned her head just enough to meet Sullivan's eyes. "Careful what you promise," she said, her voice low, steady. The laughter faltered, but only for a second. They brushed it off, waving her away like she was nothing, as Emily walked away, her med bag swinging against her hip. A young private named Carter, no relation, just a cruel coincidence, decided to pile on. He was new, eager to fit in with a nervous energy that made him loud. "Hey, Lieutenant," he called, his voice cracking with forced confidence. "You sure you're in the right place? This ain't a hospital." The group around him chuckled, egging him on. He stepped closer, his boots kicking up dust, and held up his phone, pretending to snap a picture. "Got to get this for the scrapbook nurse playing." "Soldier." The others laughed harder, a few clapping him on the back. Emily's hand tightened on her bag strap, her knuckles white, but she didn't turn around. She kept walking her steps, even her head high. The jeers faded behind her, but the weight of their words lingered heavy as the heat. The base was a sprawl of concrete and dust tucked into a valley where the mountains loomed like silent judges. The stone staircase, 200 steps carved into the hillside, led to the bunker at the top, a fortress of last resort. Everyone knew those stairs. They were a beast, steep and uneven, the kind of climb that burned your legs just looking at it. Soldiers joked about them, dared each other to race up on slow days, but no one carried a full-grown man up those steps. Not in the heat, not under fire. Emily had walked them plenty of times, her med bag bouncing against her hip, her breath steady even when her legs screamed. She never complained, never made a show of it, but the way she moved, quick, deliberate, like she was always ready for something, made a few of the older soldiers pause. Not that they'd admit it. When the ambush hit, it came like a storm. The air exploded with gunfire, sharp cracks splitting the afternoon. Alarms blared and the base turned into chaos. Soldiers scrambling, shouting, diving for cover. Emily was in the aid station when the first bullets tore through the walls. She dropped to the floor, her heart pounding, but her hands already moving, grabbing her med bag. Outside, she heard screams, orders barked. Over the radio, the thud of boots on dirt. A Marine Private Dawson was hit at the base of the staircase. He was a big guy, over 200 pounds, with a chest wound that was pouring blood. Emily sprinted toward him, her boots kicking up dust, her bag slapping against her side. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands ripping open his shirt to find the wound. Blood soaked her fingers warm and slick. Before she could even start, a voice cut through the chaos. It was Lieutenant Brady, a wiry officer with a clipboard always in hand, known for his obsession with protocol. He stood a few feet away, shouting over the gunfire, "Carter, you're out of your depth. Get back to the aid station where you belong." His face was red, his eyes narrow with frustration. A few soldiers nearby nodded, their rifles raised, but their attention on Emily. "She's going to get herself shot," one of them muttered. A private named Walsh with a habit of muttering complaints. Emily's hands didn't stop. She pressed the bandage hard against Dawson's chest. Her fingers, slick but steady. Move. She snapped her, voice sharp enough to make Walsh flinch. Brady shook his head, turning away like she was a lost cause. She didn't care. She had work to do. The other soldiers saw her there, crouched in the open, bullets snapping overhead. Carter, get back. One of them yelled, a guy named Reynolds with a buzz cut and a voice like gravel. No one can drag him up those stairs. Leave him. Emily didn't look up. She pressed a bandage against Dawson's chest, her hand steady even as the ground shook from an explosion. Nearby. No, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. He will live. Reynolds stared, his mouth half open like he couldn't believe she'd talk back. Another soldier, a wiry kid named Parker, shouted over the gunfire. She's nuts. She'll get herself killed. Emily ignored them. She looped Dawson's arm over her shoulder, her small frame bending under his weight, and stood. The first step was agony, but she took it. The staircase loomed above her each step, a jagged slab of stone worn smooth, in places by years of boots. Dawson's blood soaked into her back hot and heavy as she adjusted his weight across her shoulders. Her legs trembled, but she didn't stop. Bullets whined past, kicking up dirt at the base of the stairs. The other soldiers watched, some frozen, some shouting. She's insane. Parker yelled again, his voice cracking. They'll both die. Another guy, a stocky sergeant named Malone with a scar across his cheek, barked, medics treat wounds. Carter, they don't play hero. Laughter followed, bitter and sharp, cutting through the chaos. Emily's jaw tightened. She took another step, then another, her boots scraping against the stone. Dawson's weight pressed down, threatening to buckle her knees, but she kept moving. As she climbed, a radio crackled nearby, and a voice broke through the static. Sergeant Vega, a grizzled veteran with a limp and a reputation for never smiling. He was crouched behind a barricade, barking orders, but he paused to watch Emily. What's she trying to prove? He muttered into the radio loud enough for others to hear. She's going to kill them both for nothing. The signal carried his words to a few soldiers nearby who shook their heads, their faces tight with doubt. Emily's foot hit the next step, her breath coming in short gasps. She adjusted Dawson's weight, her shoulders screaming, and caught a glimpse of an old photo tucked into her med bag, a faded picture of her younger brother, smiling in a hospital bed after she'd helped him through a broken leg years ago. She blinked hard, her grip tightening, and kept climbing. By step 20, her breath was ragged, her arms burning. The gunfire didn't let up, and the shouts from below grew louder, more desperate. She's not going to make it, Torres said, his chipped tooth flashing, as he sneered. Look at her. She's shaking already. Emily's foot slipped on a loose stone, and she caught herself, her free hand scraping against the rock. Blood trickled from her palm, mixing with the dirt. She didn't stop. Dawson's breathing was shallow, his head laying against her shoulder. She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. Hold on, I'll get you out. Her words were soft, but they carried a fire that no one else could hear. Step after step, she climbed, her small body a silhouette against the smoke and dust. Around step 50, the weight felt unbearable. Emily's legs screamed, her back ached and her vision blurred with sweat. She could hear the men below, their voices a mix of mockery and disbelief. She's going to drop him, Jenkins said, his fake pity replaced with a smirk. Told you she's too weak. Sullivan The big Marine, who'd promised to kneel, stood with his arms crossed, watching her struggle. No way she makes it to 100, he said, loud enough for her to hear. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Her foot hit the next step, and she swayed, catching herself against the wall. For a moment, it looked like she might fall. The men below held their breath, waiting for her to break. She didn't. She straightened, adjusted Dawson's weight, and kept going. Halfway up at step 100, Emily's legs buckled. She went down on one knee, her breath coming in gasps. Dawson's blood had soaked through her uniform, staining her back and arms. The gunfire below was relentless, and the shouts from the soldiers grew crueler. "Put him down, Carter." An officer, Captain Hayes, bellowed. He was a tall man with a voice that could silence a room always. Quick to judge. You'll die before you reach the top. Another soldier, a corporal named Diaz, with a habit of chewing gum even in a firefight, laughed. 200 steps. She hasn't even made it halfway. The laughter spread sharp and cold like a blade twisting in the air. Emily's lip was bleeding now, bitten raw from the effort. She forced herself up her hands, trembling as she gripped Dawson tighter. At step 120, a shadow passed over Emily, a drone, buzzing low, its camera glinting in the sun. A tech specialist named Ortiz, a guy with glasses and a smug grin, was controlling it from a safe distance. He leaned back in his chair, watching the feed on his tablet. "Check this out," he said to the soldiers nearby, turning the screen to show Emily struggling up the stairs. "She's putting on a show, huh? Too bad it's a flop." The others laughed, crowding around the screen, their jeers mixing with the crackle of the radio. Emily didn't know about the drone, didn't see the camera capturing her every stumble. Her focus was on Dawson, on the next step on the bunker door that seemed so far away. Her hands shook as she adjusted his weight again, her fingers leaving bloody smears on his jacket. She didn't stop. The climb became a blur of pain and will. Emily's boots hit each step with a dull thud, her body screaming for rest. Dawson stirred, his voice faint, barely audible, over the gunfire. "Leave me," he whispered, his hand weak on her shoulder. Emily's face twisted, not with fear, but with something fiercer. "Shut up," she growled, her voice low and fierce. "I'm a combat medic. I save lives at any cost." Tears rolled down Dawson's face, mixing with the blood on his cheek. He gripped her shoulder tighter, like he was holding on to her strength. Emily kept climbing, her small frame shaking but unyielding. The men below watched, their taunts quieter now, their faces starting to shift. By step 150, Emily's body was failing. Her legs wobbled, her arms burned, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The bunker was in sight, its dark entrance a promise of safety. But the stairs seemed endless, each one higher than the last. The soldiers below were mostly silent now, their eyes locked on her. A few still muttered their voices, low but cutting. "She's delusional," Torres said, shaking his head. "Thinks she's some kind of hero." Emily's foot slipped again, and she caught herself, her hands scraping raw against the stone. Blood dripped from her fingers, but she didn't let go of Dawson. She could feel his pulse faint, but there, against her shoulder, that was enough. She took another step. At step 170, a gust of wind carried a familiar sound, a low rumbling engine, the kind Emily knew from her childhood. It was the sound of her father's old Jeep, the one he'd driven when he taught her to shoot in the desert. For a split second, her eyes flicked to the horizon where a supply convoy was rolling in dust, trailing behind it. The The memory hit hard. Her father's voice, calm and steady, telling her, "You don't quit, Em. Not ever." She shook her head, blinking away the sting in her eyes and refocused on the stairs. The men below didn't notice the shift in her face, didn't see the way her jaw set harder. They were too busy watching her struggle, waiting for her to fail. She didn't. She climbed her, boots grinding against the stone. Each step a defiance of their doubts. Step 200. Emily reached the bunker door, her body trembling, her uniform soaked with blood and sweat. She collapsed Dawson, still in her arms, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The door was open, and hands reached out, pulling Dawson. Inside, Emily lay there limp, her eyes half closed, her hands still clutching his jacket. The soldiers below stood, frozen, their rifles lowered, their faces pale. "She did it," Parker whispered, his voice barely audible. She actually carried him up. The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Emily didn't hear them. Her world went dark as she passed out, her body giving out at the finish line. As the medics rushed Dawson to the aid station, a small crowd gathered near the bunker door, staring at Emily's crumpled form. A lieutenant named Foster, a man with a perpetual frown and a habit of quoting regulations, stepped forward. "She's reckless," he said, his voice loud. "Enough to carry, risking 2 lives for a stunt like that. She's no hero." A few soldiers nodded, their faces uneasy, but agreeing. Others stayed silent, their eyes on Emily as the medics lifted her onto a stretcher. Her med bag lay in the dirt, the strap torn, the old photo of her brother spilling out onto the ground. No one picked it up. They carried her inside, her face pale, her breathing faint, while Foster's words lingered like a stain. Inside the bunker, medics swarmed. They took Dawson to the aid station, working fast to stabilize him. Emily was carried in two, her small frame limp and pale. The other medics shook their heads as they hooked her up 2 and 4. "Insane," one of them muttered, a guy named Collins, with tired eyes and a habit of talking too much. "Was it worth it?" Another soldier, a private named Reed with a nervous laugh, scoffed. "She thinks she's superhuman or something." A third medic, an older woman named Harris, sighed as she checked Emily's pulse. "She's pushed herself past her limits. No one comes back from that kind of exhaustion." The room was quiet, the air thick with doubt, but Dawson lived. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, and Emily's bandages, applied under fire, had held the blood in long enough. The medics worked through the night, and by morning he was stable. Whispers started, spreading through the base, quiet at first, then louder. She carried him up, all 200 steps. A soldier said, his voice low with awe, under fire, bleeding out. The men who mocked her, Kessler, Sullivan. Torres heard the words and fell silent. Their eyes dropped to the ground, their hands fidgeting. Sullivan, the big guy, who promised to kneel, stood off to the side, his face tight. He didn't say a word. Neither did the others. The air felt different now, heavier, like something had shifted. Emily lay in the aid station, her breathing shallow, her body still. The other medics watched her, their faces a mix of worry and respect. A few soldiers lingered nearby, their boots scuffing the floor. "She's still just a nurse," Torres muttered, but his voice was weak, like he didn't believe it anymore. Another guy, a private named Ellis, with a habit of chewing his nails, shook his head. "No, one's going to remember this tomorrow," he said, but his eyes kept darting to Emily's cot. The doubt lingered hanging over the room like smoke. No one knew if She'd wake up. No one knew what would happen if she did. As the night dragged on, a young medic named Patel, barely out of training and usually too shy to speak, stood by Emily's cot checking her. For he noticed something, a small worn patch on her med bag embroidered with her initials and the words, "Never quit." It was faded, stitched by hand, probably years old. Patel's hands slowed, his eyes lingering on it. He didn't say anything, but he stepped back, his shoulders straighter, and kept watch over her through the night. Outside, the base was quiet, the gunfire gone, but the tension remained. Soldiers passed by, the aid station glancing through the door, their faces unreadable. The story of Emily's climb was spreading, but so was the doubt. The whispers at one act didn't change who she was. The next morning, the sun broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the base. Emily stirred her eyes, fluttering open, her body act, every muscle screaming, but she sat up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. The aid station was quiet. The other medics gone to tend to new wounded. She swung her legs over the side, her boots touching the floor when the door swung open. A sergeant stood there, his face serious. "Carter," he said, his voice low, "you need to see this." Emily frowned, her head still foggy, but she stood steadying herself against the wall. She followed him outside her steps, slow, her med bag still slung over her shoulder. The yard was packed. 500 Marines stood in perfect formation, their uniforms crisp, their faces stone. Emily stopped her breath, catching the commanding officer, Colonel Grayson, a man with gray hair and a voice that could silence a room, stepped forward. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. "Lieutenant Carter," he said his words. Carrying across the yard, the Marines snapped to attention, their hands rising in a salute that thundered through the silence. "Sir, yes, sir," they roared, their voices shaking the ground. Emily stood there, her eyes wide, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't wipe her face. She just stood small and steady as the weight of their respect washed over her. In the crowd, a soldier named Mitchell, a quiet man who had never joined the jeering, stepped forward after the salute. He'd been one of the few to carry water to the medics during the ambush, his hands steady even as bullets flew. Now he held out Emily's med bag, the one left in the dirt by the bunker. The photo of her brother was tucked back inside, carefully placed. "You dropped this," he said, his voice soft but clear. Emily took it of her, fingers brushing the worn patch with her initials. She knotted her lips tight and slung the bag over her shoulder again. Mitchell stepped back, his eyes meeting hers for a moment before he rejoined the formation. The other soldiers watched, their silence louder than any words. The men who'd mocked her were there, too. Kessler stood in the back, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the ground. Sullivan, the big Marine, was in the second row, his face pale, his hands clenched. Torres stood off to the side, his chipped tooth hidden behind a closed mouth. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The salute said everything. Emily didn't look at them. She didn't need their apologies. She just stood there, her head high, her med bag still on her shoulder. The moment stretched, heavy and quiet, until Grayson stepped forward again. "You saved a Marine." "Carter," he said, his voice softer now. "You saved one of us." Emily nodded just, once her lips pressed tight. The days that followed were different. The base buzzed with the story of what Emily had done. Soldiers who'd never spoken to her before nodded when she passed. Others stopped to ask how she was, their voices Careful, respectful. Kessler, the loud mouth with the brick jaw, was quieter now. A week later, he was reassigned to a desk job backstage. Side, his attitude no longer welcome in. The field, Torres, the guy with the chipped tooth, found himself on the wrong end of a viral post on X where a soldier who'd seen the climb called him out for his taunts. The post spread, and Torres's name became a cautionary tale. Sullivan, the one who'd promised to. Neil lost a sponsorship deal he'd been bragging about for months. No one said why, but the timing wasn't hard to figure out. Emily didn't talk about what happened. She didn't need to. She went back to work, checking supplies, patching wounds, her hands steady as ever. But something had changed. The way she walked, the way she carried her med bag, the way her eyes met yours, it was different, stronger, not loud, not flashy, just sure. She didn't gloat over Kessler's transfer or Torres's humiliation. She didn't nod when someone mentioned Sullivan's lost deal. She just kept moving her boots, scuffing the dirt, her med bag bouncing against her hip. The base wasn't the same anymore. Neither was she. A month later, Emily was at the aid station sorting through a new shipment of supplies. The door opened and a man walked in, tall, quiet, with a presence that filled the room. Without a word, her husband, Captain Daniel Carter, a man whose name carried weight across the base. He didn't say much, just nodded to the other medics and walked to Emily's side. The room went quiet. Collins, the talkative medic, froze mid-sentence. Harris, the older medic, looked away, her hands suddenly busy. Reed, the private with a nervous laugh, stepped back, his eyes wide. No one needed to say Daniel's name. His presence was enough. Emily looked up at him, her face softening. Or the first time that day. "You're early," she said, her voice low. He smiled just a little. "Couldn't wait," he said. She closed her med bag, the snap of the clasp, loud in the silence, and walked out with him as they stepped into the yard. A young soldier, Private and Gwen, watched from a distance. He was a kid from California, barely 19, who'd always kept to himself. During the ambush, he'd seen Emily start her climb, and it had stuck with him. Now he pulled out a notebook, scribbling a letter to his mom back home. "You wouldn't believe what I saw. Here," he wrote, his pen shaking. "This medic. She carried a guy up 200 steps. Everyone said she couldn't. They were wrong." He paused, looking at Emily and Daniel, walking away, her small frame steady beside his. Newen tore the page out, folded it, and tucked it into an envelope. He didn't know it, but that letter would make its way to a local paper, spreading Emily's story further. The base kept turning. The war kept grinding, but Emily's story didn't fade. Soldiers told it in the mess hall, in the barracks, over radios to other bases. The small medic who carried a bleeding Marine up 200 steps under fire. The nurse they had laughed at who'd proved them wrong. She didn't need to shout her worth. She didn't need to fight for respect. She'd earned it step by step, with blood and sweat and an iron will. And the men who'd mocked her, they learned what happens when you underestimate someone like her. Reality has a way of catching up. Sometimes you carry the weight of other people's doubts. Sometimes you climb stairs. No, one thinks you can. Sometimes you fall, and the world expects you to stay down. But you don't. You get up. You keep going. And when you do, the ones who doubted you will see. They'll know you were never small. You were never weak. You were always enough. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally, healing.